Well, when I was giving a talk in Winchester a little while ago, I said I'd like to write a book called What Was Shakespeare Really Like? And the lady in the audience popped up and said, "You better get on with it, hadn't you?" Well, I still haven't got round to writing the book, but this talk is a kind of prolegomena for it, an initial attempt to think about ways one might approach the topic. And incidentally, in addition to what Michael said about the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust archive, we do have about half of the original documents relating to Shakespeare's life in our archives too. Well, there are a lot of questions related to the ones that I'd like to ask. In Shakespeare's own plays, what manner of man is he, says Falstaff, when a nobleman intrudes on the revels in the Boar's Head Tavern. And in the same scene, Prince Hal asks Falstaff, "What manner of man, and like your majesty?" In Twelfth Night, Olivia, referring to the disguised Viola, asks Malvolio, "What kind of man is he?" And then, "What manner of man?" And in The Winter's Tale, the clown asks Autolycus, "What manner of fellow was he that robbed you?" It's a natural enough question at any time and in any place, and it's especially relevant to a dramatist seeking to depict human beings in real-life situations, rather than, for example, the stylized abstractions of the morality plays. And the question itself would have been familiar to Shakespeare's audiences, not least from the words of St. Mark about Jesus in the King James Bible. What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Of course, it's a question which has provoked a whole school or technique of criticism based on the attempt to define and analyse characters within the plays and to discuss their origins, even to portray their girlhoods on the basis of what they say and do, what's said about them, as if they were real people. It's a method often associated with the late Victorian critic A.C. Bradley. And it's a question that's provoked dispute as well as agreement. It was famously mocked by L.C. Knights in his essay, How Many Children Had Lady Macbeth? Bradley himself has a substantial, thoughtful, if ponderously expressed, essay called Shakespeare the Man. It's in the Oxford Lectures on Poetry. And there he sounds a bit defensive about what he's doing. He writes that the natural desire to know whatever can be known of him is not to be repressed merely because there are people so foolish as to be careless about his works and yet curious about his private life. I think there may be a covert reference here to contemporary responses, such as those of Oscar Wilde and Samuel Butler, to homosexual readings of Shakespeare's sonnets, contemporary, with Bradley's time. And Bradley confesses, "Though I should care nothing about the man if he had not written the works, yet since we possess them, I'd rather see and hear him for 5 minutes in his proper person than discover a new work." Rather odd admission. Would you swap, say, Love's Labour's Won or even Cardenio for 5 minutes with Shakespeare, possibly on a bad day? Well, Bradley goes on, "And though we may be content to die without knowing the income or even the surname of Mr. W.H., we cannot so easily resign the wish to find the man in his writings, and to form some idea of the disposition, the likes and dislikes, the character and the attitude towards life of the human being who seems to us to have understood best our common human natures." Curiously enough, Shakespeare himself uses the word character not often, and mostly in relation to handwriting, as in Know You the Hand. It is Hamlet's character, obviously from Hamlet. And indeed, OED doesn't give the sense, the modern sense, which he defines as the individuality impressed by nature and habit on a man or nation, mental or moral constitution. It doesn't give that until 1647. I wonder if that perhaps is a result of a general shift in thought about human individuality. It's natural to apply the question not only to characters in Shakespeare's plays, but also to the author. But it's not easily answered. a narrative account of the bare facts of a person's journey through life, their parentage and education, their career, the actions that a man might play, do not, as Hamlet knows, pluck out the heart of his mystery. A curriculum vitae or a who's who entry may supply such an account. What people show to the world around them may reveal little or nothing of their inner being, just as the visible signs of Hamlet's mourning for Claudius are but the trappings and the suits of woe. Biographical studies of Shakespeare vary in the degree to which they attempt to dig below the surface to interpret the facts of his life in search of the inner man. Some accounts are pretty well wholly objective. I think of E.K. Chambers' study of facts and problems, for example, or Schoenbaum's documentary life and its lesser-known sequel, Records and Images, which offer raw materials for the biography that Schoenbaum hoped to write but didn't live long enough to do so. His later book, Shakespeare's Lives, heroically charts many hundreds of previous attempts to do so, and does so in a very entertaining manner. At the other extreme from these more or less objective accounts is Catherine Duncan-Jones's Shakespeare, An Ungentle Life, which combatively proclaims its interpretive stance in its very title. She's picking up on the fact that several of Shakespeare's contemporaries, including Ben Jonson, both in his verses printed below the Droeshout portrait in the first folio, and also in his elegy, that Ben Jonson referred to him as gentle, which could, of course, refer to social status, as in gentleman, no less than it could refer to character. In her view, the adjective as applied to Shakespeare's character is undeserved. Making interpretive use of the absence of evidence, she remarks in the blurb of her book that, unlike other local worthies or his actor contemporary Edward Allen, Shakespeare shows no inclination to divert any of his wealth towards charitable, neighbourly, or altruistic ends. Not true, because he left £10 to the poor of Stratford, quite a lot of money at that time, and there are also in his will bequests to neighbours and to other persons outside the immediate family circle. Arguing disputably that the phrase "my second best bed" is a disagreeable and reluctant afterthought, she interprets the curse on what's believed to be Shakespeare's grave as a successful attempt to ensure that neither his wife's remains nor those of any other family member could ever be inserted in that deeply dug grave. That rhetorical flourish in deeply dug is contradicted by the results of the recent scan of the grave, previously rumoured to be 17 feet deep, which in fact was quite shallow. There have also been attempts, less fashionable now than previously, to apply the techniques of psychoanalysts to Shakespeare through interpretation of both the life records and the works. For example, there's a volume called Shakespeare's Personality, edited by Norman Holland in 1989, in which he and other scholars offer a series of essays, many of them based on Freudian psychology, relating Shakespeare's life to his works. The index includes entries for such subjects as Shakespeare's compliant tendencies, his erotic versus aggressive drives, his phallic fantasy, his sexual fantasies, his abhorrence of vagina, which seemed to leave no doubt about his sexuality, and his vindictive impulses. For all its intellectual sophistication, work like this has to negotiate two difficult obstacles. One is our imperfect knowledge of the facts of Shakespeare's life. Several of the contributors to the volume, for example, make much of what the editor refers to in his introduction as Shakespeare's father's loss of patriarchal authority as a result of his financial decline. But that supposed financial decline is imperfectly documented and is indeed disputed in a recent study. If his fortunes did not decline, then theories of the supposed psychological effect of it on Shakespeare are obviously invalidated. And another obstacle is the fact that Shakespeare's writings are not purely the product of his own imagination, but that they draw heavily, both for their plots and their language, on historical events and on writings by other people. So they can't properly be thought of as purely the projections of his subconscious mind. To give an example close to home, in more than one sense, there's a speech in Henry IV, Part 2, the play written about the time that Shakespeare was buying and renovating New Place, in which it's tempting to suppose that he was drawing on his recent personal experience. It goes, "When we mean to build, we first survey the plot, then draw the model, and when we see the figure of the house, then must we rate the cost of the erection, which if we find outweighs ability, what do we do then but draw anew the model in fewer offices, or at least desist to build at all?" The temptation to relate that to Shakespeare's activities at New Place dwindles, however, when we find that the lines paraphrase quite closely the parable of the builder in St. Luke's Gospel. Well, attempts like those in the Holland volume to offer an interpretation of the external evidence in the hope of defining the manner of a man must delve beneath the exterior facts in endeavouring to define the essentials of his personality, what makes him different from other men, what characterizes his attitude to his fellow human beings, and the way he reacts to the situations in which he finds himself. Questions such as qualities such as his sense of humour, his tenacity, his conscientiousness, his predictability, his temperament, his sensibility, his sexuality, his attitudes to the great questions of life and death, his spirituality, his moral stances, and his imaginative makeup. For the Elizabethans, these qualities were determined by the four bodily humours, black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, which in turn influenced the four basic temperaments, choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic, and sanguine. Such simplistic, rough and ready categorizations offer simply pigeonholes into which people can be slotted without regard for true individuality. Attempts at definition of character demand far more subtlety. They must acknowledge, too, that personality is not constant, that people change and develop over the years, that appetites alter. As Benedict says in Much Ado, a man may love the meat in his youth that he cannot endure in his age. Well, are there, in spite of the numerous gaps in our knowledge about Shakespeare's life, the paucity of personal documentation, the absence of self-revelatory letters, such as we have for Keats, of diaries such as those in Shakespeare's own time of Simon Forman, a bit later Pepys, or closer to our own time, Virginia Woolf, intimate memoirs or documentary films that we have from more recent writers? Are there, in spite of such absences, ways in which we can attempt to pluck out the heart of Shakespeare's mystery? Well, to start with, the absences are not total. We have expressions of opinion about Shakespeare from contemporaries, some posthumous, many of them gathered together in the 2-volume Shakespeare Allusion book, badly out of date, though that is. The allusions start in 1592, when he was 28, with Green's, or is it Chettle's, description of him in Green's Groatsworth of wit as an upstart crow. And we also have Chettle's defence of Shakespeare against the attack in his Kind Heart's Dream, where Chettle says, "I am as sorry as if the original fault had been my fault, because myself have seen Shakespeare's demeanour no less civil than he is excellent in the quality he professes. Besides, divers of worship have reported his uprightness of dealing, which argues his honesty, and his facetious grace in writing that approves his art." It's the first time, incidentally, that the word facetious, which comes from the Latin word meaning witty, it's the first time that that word appears in English, according to the OED. Here, the phrase facetious grace seems to mean something like amusing skill. It would be good to know, wouldn't it, who the divers of worship were. Might they have included the Earl of Southampton? Anyhow, this is a powerful character reference. And to the best of my belief, the upstart crow jibe is the only denigratory surviving reference to Shakespeare's character made by any of his contemporaries throughout his career. We also have favourable mentions in several commendatory poems and in the Parnassus plays. "Oh, sweet Master Shakespeare, I have his picture in my study at the court," says Gallio. And we have predictably laudatory comments and tributes in the first folio, including Ben Jonson's great elegy. That poem is more concerned with Shakespeare's artistry and his fame than with his personality, but Jonson does refer to Shakespeare as his beloved. He says that the race of Shakespeare's mind and manners brightly shines in his well-turned and true filed lines, and he calls him sweet, that word again, sweet Swan of Avon. Hemmings and Cundall, in their dedication, also write about his personality. He was their worthy friend and fellow, whose reputation they want to keep alive. And in their preface, addressed to the great variety of readers, they write of him as a gentle expresser of nature. Of course, they're not writing on oath. They say his mind and hand went together, and what he thought he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. But anybody who's worked on the text of the folio knows that it simply isn't true that, as they claim, there was scarcely a blot in any of the papers from which it was printed. Some of the quartos used in setting up the volume must have been peppered with annotations. And even if they are referring only to manuscripts written in Shakespeare's hand, signs of revision in printed texts of some of the plays suggest that they're exaggerating. But the amount of effort that Hemmings and Cundall put into compiling that volume is itself a testimony, surely, to their affection for the man who left money for them, along with Richard Burbage, who died before the folio went to press. He left them money to buy, it's rather conventional sort of bequest, to buy mourning rings. Most intimately, of course, we have Drummond's unbuttoned conversations with William Drummond of Hawthornden, conversations written down several years before the publication of Jonson's elegy. And these express views about Shakespeare's artistry, which Jonson found wanting, of course, and more interesting in relation to Shakespeare's personality, we also have the comments in Jonson's notebooks, which were published after Jonson had died as Timber, or Discoveries upon Men and Matter, as they have flowed out of his daily readings or had their reflux to his peculiar notion of the times. Curious phraseology, isn't it? Reflux sounds like something to do with the stomach. These give us what must surely be the most honest and the fullest assessment of Shakespeare's character, deriving from a contemporary. Jonson says, "I loved the man, and to honour his memory, on this side idolatry, as much as any. He was indeed honest and of an open and free nature, had an excellent fancy, imagination, brave notions, and gentle expressions, wherein he flowed with that facility that sometime it was necessary who should be stopped. Softly mandus erat, as Augustus said of Haterius. That is to say, he needed to be checked or reined in. His wit, he goes on, was in his own power. Would the rule of it had been so too. Jonson finds himself lacking in literary discipline. But he redeemed his vices with his virtues. There was ever more in him to be praised than to be pardoned." In spite of the cautious qualification in those words, "this side idolatry," that is surely a noble and generous character reference from a writer who had once been Shakespeare's rival. And it corroborates what Chettle had written many years before about the young Shakespeare. Jonson's criticism that Shakespeare sometimes overwrote is one that Shakespeare himself might have agreed with, judging both by the varying length of his plays and also by the cuts that he or his company made in, for example, Richard II and in Hamlet. Along with the rather generalized tributes to Shakespeare's character, we can add the negative evidence of his capacity to keep out of trouble with the law. Most of his fellow playwrights, unlike him, spent time in prison for a variety of reasons. Marlowe for, among others, suspected murder, Ben Jonson for killing a man in a duel, Dekker on numerous occasions for debt. William Shakespeare of Bishopsgate was listed as having defaulted on tax payments in both September 1597 and October 1598, but there are no records that he was ever prosecuted, and a great many other people were defaulted on their tax payments. His only known brush with the law of a kind at all similar to those of his fellows is in a case, a lawsuit of 1596, in which a man called William Waite served on Shakespeare and on several other theatre people a writ requiring them to keep the peace, quote, for fear of death and mutilation of limbs, as if they'd been accused of assault. According to Schoenbaum, however, that is a conventional legal phrase in such documents. It's an obscure incident, ignored or passed over lightly by most biographers of Shakespeare. By and large, Shakespeare seems to have been exceptionally law-abiding, and his acting company, too, avoided such brushes with the law as the one that caused Jonson to be imprisoned and Nash to be exiled to the provinces over performances of the lost play The Isle of Dogs. What about Shakespeare's outward appearance? And how much would that tell us? Byler says in Twelfth Night, nature with a beauteous wall doth oft close in pollution. Lady Macbeth says there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. Still, we keep on hoping. The popularity of portrait painting in Shakespeare's own time, the popularity more recently of photographic portraiture, suggests, doesn't it, an abiding hope that character may be revealed by outward appearance. We have evidence of varying degrees of reliability about what Shakespeare looked like. The Drusite engraving, certified as a true likeness by Ben Jonson, but still pretty stylized. The Holy Trinity bust, which Bradley says suggests that he was not in later life a meagre man. The Chandos and the Cobb portraits, both of them disputed in provenance, and the late report by Aubrey that he was a handsome, well-shaped man. Everything suggests that there was nothing exceptional about his appearance. Various other potentially revealing areas of investigation exist. It's possible to assess his attitudes to work, to deduce something about his ambition, his conscientiousness, his industry, by looking at the tasks he undertook, his career as an actor, as a non-dramatic poet, mostly in his early years, as a theatre administrator, helping for 2 decades to manage a single theatre company, all of which suggests, I think, a high degree of stability and of conscientiousness. And above all, his record as a playwright, producing an average of about 2 plays a year over 2 decades or more. We have information about the number of plays and poems that he wrote. We know something about when he wrote them and the amount of reading that lies behind them, so we can gain an idea of how industrious he was. We can think about how he got on with his colleagues, observing, for instance, that they stuck together in the theatre company over long periods of time, that he both received and made bequests to some of them, that it's clear from printed texts that he had individual actors in mind as he wrote. We can think about his financial affairs, his purchases and his investments, how extensive they were, where they were, to what purpose he made them. We can think about his family concerns. We can speculate about his relationship with his wife and with members of her family. How much can we deduce from the fact that Shakespeare seems to have lived relatively modestly in more than one neighbourhood in London, and to have poured most of his financial resources into property and land in Stratford, where, from the age of 33, only 3 years after the founding of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, he bought the largest house in the borough. Information like this may help us to assess where his priorities lay, how much he cared about his family and his social status. We can examine the will, thinking about what it reveals about his standing in the local community at the time of his death. There's a fascinating article about the will in the volume that Paul and I edited recently called The Shakespeare Circle, where Susan Brock has a whole chapter on Shakespeare's will. We can deduce something from the will about his attitudes to the surviving relatives and friends. But of course, as the dispute about the significance of the phrase the second best bed, as that illustrates, such apparently objective evidence is just as subject to variable interpretation as any other. Even without the aid of psychoanalytical techniques, such as those deployed by Norman Holland, we can assess much from Shakespeare's writings about his mental qualities. We can say confidently that he was highly articulate, at least on the page, that he had a wide, flexible vocabulary, and that vocabulary developed and changed over the years. We can examine the vocabulary to see what it can tell us about his areas of knowledge, such as the law, the court, and the countryside, hunting, shooting, and fishing, his familiarity with dialects and with languages other than English, and with various kinds of technical language. We can see how he deployed his vocabulary in his writings, his awareness of rhetorical devices, and the development in his skill of using them, his innovative powers. We can observe, for example, that he uses highly specialized language of horse breeding in a speech by Biondello in The Taming of the Shrew, and that a speech in Much Ado About Nothing shows remarkable familiarity with women's clothing. The Duchess of Milan's wedding gown was made of cloth of gold and cuts and laced with silver, set with pearls, down sleeves, side sleeves and skirts, round, underborne with a bluish tinsel. And we may wonder where he got all that from. Thinking about his exposure to the wall paintings in the Guild Chapel down the road here, we may speculate about whether they, or similar paintings elsewhere, rather than, or as well as, biblical knowledge, stimulated his use of imagery of doom in Othello. Whip me, ye devils, from the possession of this heavenly sight. Blow me about in wind, roast me in sulphur, wash me in steep down gulfs of liquid fire. Clearly, Shakespeare had an exceptional sense of verbal rhythm, an ear for the musical qualities of language, and a capacity to tussle with complex ideas, as he does, for example, in Troilus and Cressida especially. And of course, we know that he was capable of extreme sexual wordplay, sometimes used to scintillatingly comic ends, as in Love Service Lost, for example, but also in profound explorations of sexual torment and even disgust in plays such as Timon of Athens and Troilus and Cressida, and also in some of the sonnets. We have no record of his exercising this skill in sexual wordplay in private life. Indeed, the records of what he actually said, mainly in the Mountjoy case and in conversations with some of his Stratford friends about financial matters and about the welcome enclosures, these records are sparse. We can relate such matters to interpretations of his character and his plays. Is there, as Catherine Duncan-Jones seems to suggest, is there a significant, even hypocritical division between the man who can make King Lear pray for poor homeless wretches and, on the other hand, the landowner who, a few years after writing that, seems more concerned about his own financial security than about the interests of the poor people of Stratford? We can deduce a lot about Shakespeare's writings from his education. And we can relate this to what we know about the curriculum of the school that was available to him. Sometimes, especially in his early plays, he quotes directly from works of classical literature in the original language. It's interesting how, if you look at his Latin quotations chronologically over his career, they dwindle, as if the memory of his education was fresher in the earlier plays than later. Of course, all this is becoming a bit muddied in the light of new theories about his collaborations. We know a lot about the amount of reading he had to do for some of his plays. We can assess his knowledge of the Bible. We can try to deduce which parts of the Bible he found most to his taste. We can even deduce what he was reading at certain times. Nazib Shaheen, in his study of Shakespeare's use of the Bible, notes echoes of Revelation in Antony and Cleopatra, and suggests that since the only 3 chapters of Revelation were read during morning and evening prayer in the Church of England, Shakespeare must have privately read much of Revelation shortly before or during the composition of Antony and Cleopatra. We can argue, as people have interminably argued, about whether his writings betray his religious leanings. Was he a Protestant? Did he have Roman Catholic sympathies? How did he react, both personally and professionally, about Puritanism? We can see, making use of Bullo's narrative and dramatic sources, and also of Stuart Gillespie's no less valuable study of Shakespeare's books, we can see that he went on reading assiduously and widely throughout his working life. And we may make deductions from that about his sociability, helped perhaps by Aubrey's remark, he was not a company keeper, lived in Shoreditch, wouldn't be debauched, and if invited to, Ritty was in pain. We can see that he had a taste for certain sorts of literature, the poetry of his contemporaries and predecessors, works of English and classical history, Italianate romance, popular English fiction, philosophical writings, including the essays of Montaigne, studies of contemporary issues like the declaration of egregious popish impostures by Samuel Harsnet. And we can be certain from the dates of publication of some of these books that he remained an assiduous reader throughout his life. We may note absences from the record too, such as the small impact on him, apparently, of Spenser's Faerie Queene. Are there other books which were popular at the time, but which nevertheless seem not to have been to Shakespeare's taste? We can envisage him both as a playgoer and as a reader of dramatic and poetic texts, interacting with contemporary literary and dramatic trends, following some, ignoring others. And we can think what, if anything, that tells us about his own cast of mind. We can deduce that he saw and learnt from plays and poems written by his contemporaries, including Marlowe, whose poem Hero and Leander clearly influenced Venus and Adonis, and who is the only contemporary to whom, under the guise of a dead shepherd, Shakespeare alludes in his plays. We know, or we think we know, that in his early years he was enough of a team player to collaborate with Peele on Titus Andronicus, and it now seems possibly with Marlowe and with Nash in the early histories. And we can see him continuing to plough his own furrow from 1594 onwards as an essentially romantic dramatist in face of the growing popularity of city comedy, led by Jonson, and of satirical tragedy in the works of writers like Marston and Middleton, even though he did apparently find enough sympathy with Middleton to collaborate with him and to draw on his individual talents for at least the more satirical scenes of Timon of Athens. And we can perhaps more readily understand how, in Shakespeare's later years, he found a congenial collaborator in the more romantically inclined John Fletcher. At the same time, we may wonder how he got on with the villainous George Wilkins, and our knowledge that he worked with him may extend our sense of Shakespeare's powers of tolerance. Through a study of the texts on which he worked with other writers, we can think about what such collaboration involved. It doesn't, for example, necessarily mean that he sat down in the same room as Marlowe or Middleton or Fletcher or Wilkins, and that they worked on both plot and dialogue in intimate communion. Ben Jonson boasts in the prologue to Volpone that he wrote the play single-handed within the space of 5 weeks. He says, "'Tis known full 5 weeks fully penned from his own hand, without a coadjutor, novice, journeyman, or tutor." Jonson there usefully defines 4 different kinds of collaborator. Coadjutor is an ecclesiastical term referring to a bishop's assistant. So here, I suppose, we may take it to apply to a more or less equal collaborator. Novice seems to imply a beginner or apprentice playwright. Journeyman, a hack writer. Tutor, an experienced writer working alongside and advising a novice. George Peele, with whom it's now believed that Shakespeare worked on Titus Andronicus, was 8 years older than Shakespeare. Was he, as it were, the tutor, and Shakespeare the novice? If Shakespeare really did collaborate with his almost exact contemporary Christopher Marlowe, were they genuine coadjutors, or was the more experienced Marlowe in charge? Or did they perhaps devise plots together and then write their allotted scenes independently? In Shakespeare's later years, was he perhaps tutor to Thomas Middleton and to John Fletcher, both of whom were about 16 years younger than he was? Study of the structure of Shakespeare's plays can help us to identify qualities of mind that made him successful as a plotter, as somebody who could construct a complex dramatic structure, who had a practical knowledge of the theatrical conditions of his time, of the limitations imposed by the fact that only male actors would appear in his plays, that he needed to lay out his plot so that an individual actor might be required to take more than one role, quite an intellectual feat. We can guess that such exigencies affected his plotting. Did Lady Montague, for example, did Lady Montague die before her time because there was no one left to play her in the final scene of Romeo and Juliet? We can sometimes identify limitations in Shakespeare's dramatic techniques and development as he gained in experience. We can see him as an observer of the life around him, as somebody who knew, whether from direct experience or through his reading, about domestic life, the law, music, philosophy, plants and gardens, hunting and wildlife. We can think about his sense of humour, what made him laugh, or at least what he thought might make other people laugh. We can think about his sense of individual character, both by observing how he makes characters in his plays speak and behave, and also by observing what he makes them say about other characters, their moral attitudes, their foibles and sensitivities. We can look at his portrayal of human idiosyncrasy, observing his sympathetic amusement at the ramblings of the nurse in Romeo and Juliet and Justice Shallow, at the immature illusions of the lords in Love's Labour's Lost, the affected language of Osric, the social pretensions of the old shepherd and his son in The Winter's Tale. We can try to assess his sensibility by examining how in his plays he imagines himself into his characters' attitudes to the life around them. We can observe, for example, that he was capable of empathizing with the suffering of animals. The poor beetle that we tread upon in corporal sufferance finds a pang as great as when a giant dies, says Isabella in Measure for Measure. Or, if he, not Middleton as is now claimed, wrote the fly scene in Titus Andronicus, how if that fly had a father and a mother? How would he hang his slender gilded wings and buzz lamenting doings in the air? Poor harmless fly, that with his pretty buzzing melody came here to make us merry, and thou hast killed him. And in Pericles, Marina shows the same sort of sensibility when she says, "Believe me, La, I never killed a mouse, nor hurt a fly. I trod upon a worm against my will, but I wept for it. We can wonder how common such empathy was at the time. I remember Terence Spencer saying that he'd noticed it only in Shakespeare and in Montaigne. Reverting to the life records, we can think about the dedications to the narrative poems and what this may imply about his relationship with the Earl of Southampton. We can link this with related anecdotal evidence, such as the legend that the Earl gave him £1,000. Seems an awful lot of money, but OED does allow that the word thousand had for several centuries at this time been used vaguely as hyperbolically for a large number. It may have just been a way of saying that the Earl gave him a hell of a lot of money. I owe you £1,000, says Falstaff to Hal, of course, to Justice Sheridan. In contrast to this is Shakespeare's apparent lack of concern for the publication of his plays. Is that because publication would have brought him not much or perhaps no money? Or because he was indifferent to the opinions of the reading public? Or just because he was too busy? Did he leave money to Hemmingson, Cundall and Burbage because he hoped they would publish the 1623 folio? And we may ask how his attitude to publication compared with that of his fellow playwrights. We can think about the absences in the literary as well as the biographical record. For example, the fact that in spite of his massive literary talent, he wrote almost entirely for the theatre. It's a bit of a paradox that today, World Book Day, Shakespeare heads the list published today by the Royal Society of Literature for readers, and yet, of course, he wasn't writing on the whole for readers. He seems not to have written masques or pageants, or what we may call public poems, like commendatory verses for other people's work, comments on national events, or tributes on the death of members of the royal family, such as Queen Elizabeth or Prince Henry. Most of the other writers at the time did pay such tributes. We can wonder about the phoenix and the turtle and the mysteries of that poem. We can think about the implications for Shakespeare's personality of his choice of subject matter for his plays, of the fact that almost all of them are set in the past, and, except of course for the English history plays, in foreign lands. And in relation to this, we can consider how his choice of subject matter compares with that of his contemporaries. We can think about his fondness for Italian sources, the comparative absence from his plays of clear topical references, his general avoidance of direct contemporary satire. If there's anywhere that Shakespeare seems to be speaking in his own person, it's in his sonnets. How personal are they? To what extent, if at all, are they based on his real-life situations in which he was implicated? How much do they reveal about his relationships with other men and with women? Were they written for love or for money? Were they intended for publication? Are they truly a sonnet sequence, intended to be read from start to finish? I wrote at some length about this subject in an essay called My Name is Will, which was republished recently by Collected Essays. And in that essay, I attempt a kind of taxonomy of the sonnets. It's a very obvious topic for further work. How much can we learn from the decisions that Shakespeare made about what sort of plays to write, to diversify his output in an approximate alternation between comedy and tragedy? We can think about how much he was fired by commercial considerations, how much by artistic and intellectual ambition. Does he ever seem to be sacrificing artistic integrity to expediency? Is he ever writing down to his audiences, pandering to the so-called groundlings? Was Robert Bridges right when he wrote, "The foolish things in his plays were written to please the foolish, the filthy for the filthy, and the brutal for the brutal"? Is he, on the other hand, sometimes writing for a specialized audience of more intellectual sophistication than is usually associated with the public theatres, undervalued though I believe those audiences to be? Was he sometimes writing, for example, for members of the Inns of Court, as has been suggested, of plays as diverse as The Comedy of Errors and Troilus and Cressida? Is he sycophantic in his attitude to royalty, as has been suggested of Macbeth? How closely does he engage with the politics of his time? Are the new historicists right in discerning covert concern with contemporary political issues in plays which ostensibly take ancient history as their subject matter? Do personal issues enter into his plays? Does his portrayal of relationships between fathers and daughters in the late plays reflect his personal concerns, as has been suggested? How does this relate to the concept of him writing for readers rather than for audiences? We can observe Shakespeare's sympathetic portrayal of morally dubious characters, like Bardolph and Doll Tearsheet, Perrault, Toby Belch, even Falstaff. And we can contrast this, I think, with his evident dislike of such cold fish as Prince John and Angelo, Don John, Octavius Caesar, or Giacomo. Some characters in his plays, like Richard II and Iago, may seem unmitigatedly evil, but other villains, like Macbeth, even Edmund, are portrayed with a degree of sympathy and understanding, and he's unmoralistic about, for example, the passions of Antony and Cleopatra. I think we can deduce something about Shakespeare's personal opinions from the plays. He seems to me to have distrusted people like Iago and Goneril, Regan, above all Edmund in King Lear, who express a severely rationalistic view of life and of morality. He seems to have sympathized more easily with the sceptical irrationality of Gloucester and indeed of Hamlet. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio. There's a speech by Lafew in All's Well That Ends Well, in which I think that for once we can hear Shakespeare speaking. They say miracles are past, and we have philosophical persons to make modern and familiar things that are supernatural and causeless. Hence is it that we make trifles of terrors, ensconcing ourselves into seeming knowledge when we should submit ourselves to an unknown fear. He's suggesting that clever, excessively rational people try to reduce to a commonplace level matters that are beyond human understanding, reducing the mysteries of the universe to a series of scientific formulae, making trifles of terrors, instead of opening their imaginations to the fullness of experience, or, as he puts it here, submitting themselves to an unknown fear, to the uncertainties of the unknown and the unknowable. It's an exact description of the error that Lady Macbeth makes in thinking that she can ignore the promptings of imagination. Essentially, it seems to me, this identifies Shakespeare as someone who acknowledges the mystery of human life, but is not bound by any dogma. We can also, I think, discern something about the subconscious workings of Shakespeare's mind in images that are not directly demanded by the narrative, in a manner that was adumbrated by Caroline Spurgeon in her book on Shakespeare's imagination, and more subtly by Edward Armstrong in his book Shakespeare's Imagination, Study of the Psychology of Association and Inspiration, published in 1943, where he discerns recurrent image clusters that may help to trace the workings of Shakespeare's subconscious mind. And I notice in Shakespeare's work a recurrent preoccupation with imagery of diminution, as in Edgar's description of Dover Cliff. The crows and choughs that wing the midway air show scarce as gross as beetles. Halfway down hangs one that gathers samphire, dreadful trade. Methinks he seems no bigger than his head. The fishermen that walk upon the beach appear like mice, and yon tall anchoring bark, diminished to her cock, a buoy almost too small for sight. And this comes again elsewhere, as when Imogen is imagining Posthumus's departure. I would have broke mine eye strings, cracked them, but to look upon him, till the diminution of space had pointed him sharp as my needle. Nay, followed him, till he had melted from the smallness of a gnat to air, and then have turned mine eyes and wept. And maybe this preoccupation relates also to recurrent imagery of a coming together of opposites, as several times in the Winter's Tale. For example, when Camillo says about Leontes and Polixenes, they seemed to be together, though absent, shook hands as over a vast, and embraced, as it were, from the ends of opposed winds. Or in the young shepherd's words, I am not to say it is a sea, for it is now the sky. Betwixt the firmament and it you cannot thrust a bodkin's point. It's present in Othello too, for do but stand upon the burning shore, the chidden billow seems to pelt the clouds, the wind-shaked surge with high and monstrous mane seems to cast water on the burning bear and quench the guards of the ever-fixed pole. Those are just a few instances of points in the plays where the poetic content seems to me to be determined as much by Shakespeare's subconscious mind as by the requirements of the story he's telling. Well, I've identified, I think, about 25 possible ways of considering the question I started with. How might one write a book called What Was Shakespeare Really Like? All that remains, as the lady in Winchester said, is for me to get on with it. Thank you.